Today, what we're going to do is turn our attention to slavery, and particularly we're going to try to understand how religion functioned in the slave communities as both a force for oppression and a force for liberation. It is impossible to understand American identity in general, and certainly American religious identity in the 19th century, without understanding how important and central slavery was. And as I would imagine all of you would agree, we're still dealing with the legacy of slavery even today. So it's important that we all understand it just a little bit. So today we're going to do that, invisible institution, religion in the slave communities. Next week, I'm going to turn my attention to Abraham Lincoln. We're going to understand his own religious views, which fluctuated a fair bit, but also how he used religious institutions to promote nationalism during the Civil War era. In our last week, we're going to turn our attention to how religion functioned in the war camps and also the enduring legacy of the Civil War. So I hope you're with us for both those two lessons as well. They're both fun to teach, talk about, and field questions from. But I want to start today with a story. It's a story that actually chronologically would take place probably toward the end of our narrative today. But it's a story that I think might be a good way to set the tone. It was actually a story that I've adapted and rewritten to make it a little bit more understandable, but originally it came from an abolitionist book that we'll talk a little bit more about in a few moments. But in the year 1850, Congress passed a series of very unpopular laws. These laws were passed primarily to appease Southern slaveholders, and collectively they were known as, well, the Fugitive Slave Act, part of the Compromise of 1850. And the Fugitive Slave Act, which was hated in most of the northern states, essentially mandated that federal and local authorities in northern states would make sure to return African Americans who escaped slavery in the South and fled to the North. Well, Northerners pledged to return those escaped slaves that had fled to the North back to, well, the Southern slaveholders. As you can imagine, particularly for those people who thought slavery was terrible, this set of laws was incredibly controversial and widely reviled. In 1860, 10 years after this very controversial set of laws was passed, we're in the small town at the time, or medium-sized town of Troy, New York. The year is 1860, spring has come, we're still about a year away from Fort Sumter, the beginnings of the Civil War, and a fugitive slave by the name of Charles Nail has been captured and was being prepared to be sent back to Virginia. Nail had escaped slavery, had escaped his bondage just 2 years earlier. And the funny thing about Charles Nail is that he looked a whole lot like the man who claimed to be his master. And that's likely because Nail's master, his slaveholder, was his half-brother, and the two men looked a lot alike. Well, Charles Nail is gathered up. A wagon has been prepared and placed outside the U.S. Commissioner's office where he's being held. But a big anti-slavery crowd who very much opposes the Fugitive Slave Act has gathered outside the U.S. Commissioner's office. Well, and the officers are trying to figure out what to do. There's a large crowd outside. We've got this slave. We're ready to return him to his so-called master in the South. How do we prevent, well, chaos from ensuing? As the officers contemplated their next course of action, a dark-skinned woman who appeared to be older moved through the crowd. She was short, she was slender, maybe 5 feet tall. And a keen observer, somebody who looked very closely at her, which almost no one did, might have noticed a small, slight scar that barely visible under her bonnet. Now, strangely, as this tiny woman began to move, the crowd that had gathered began to part way to make room for her. She ascended the stairs leading to the room where the fugitive, Charles Nail, was being held. And once she reached the door, she simply stood and waited. Firm as an oak, she stood. Moments passed. Moments became hours and they passed as well. And as people began to get more agitated with the waiting, as the officers began to get more fearful with the crowd outside, one man in the crowd uttered to another, "They must have taken him out another way. They must have. It's been too long." The man responded to his friend and said, "No, you see that woman? That old woman by the door? There stands Moses. Yet as long as he is there, he is safe." That slender woman's name was Harriet Tubman, and she had always been much more clever and driven than any 10 men. She whispered in the ear of two young boys and ordered them to cry that a fire had broken out, and they did. And so bells rang. The shoutings of the crowd intensified. The officer tried to clear the stairs, but Harriet, she didn't budge. The officer turned to the seemingly older woman and said, "Old woman, you must get out of here." Harriet was actually only 40 years old at the time, which seemed younger and younger to me every day. And Harriet always tried to make herself look older when she was in these chaotic situations. And she just stooped over, twitched, and barely moved out of the way, even as the officer tried to prod her. But the officers were impatient. Things were getting more chaotic with that so-called fire alarm that was going on. So the officers pushed through the crowd with this man, Charles Nail, this fugitive slave with them. And as soon as they appeared, Harriet Tubman rose from her bent over position, darted down the stairs, grabbed one officer, and pulled him down. She then latched on to the fugitive slave and shouted to the crowd, "Take him, drag us out, drag him to the river, drown him if you have to, but don't let them have him." As Harriet and Charles Nail, this poor fugitive, were knocked down together, she tore the bonnet from her scarred head and quickly tied it around the head of the fugitive slave, Charles Nail. He was unrecognizable in this swarm, this crowd of people, and the poor fugitive, while utterly helpless, while bleeding, while bruised, Harriet never let go of him. Not until she helped drag that man through the crowd to a nearby river, where she threw him into a boat she had arranged ahead of time and put the fugitive on the journey to freedom to Canada. Years earlier, a friend had asked Harriet, a dedicated member of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, which Harriet belonged to most of her life. Her friend had asked her, "Why, Harriet, didn't you almost feel when you were lying alone as if there was no God?" Harriet Tubman responded, "Oh no, I just asked Jesus to take care of me, and he's never letting me get frostbitten even one bit." When we talk about religion and the Civil War era, it's fair to say that it's a ubiquitous thing. Religion is everywhere during this era. Most of the folks who were ardent abolitionists, in fact, almost all of them, were affiliated with one of the strong mainline Protestant churches. Religion motivated the abolitionist crusade, much as it also motivated or provided justification for slavery for some folks in the South, which we talked about last week. Harriet Tubman is a good example of an abolitionist that was heavily motivated by religion. We'll talk more about her later today, but Tubman was someone who even thought she had religious visions and was purely and completely motivated by her faith in God throughout her life, which is what allowed her to do some of the remarkable deeds that she did. Okay, so as we get started today, there's a couple images here you might find interesting. This is from the ladies department. This is from the Female Anti-Slavery Society. This is Am I Not a Woman and a Sister? This is a female adaptation of an English anti-slavery drawing that you may have seen in the past. The second image is from Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's one of Hammett Billings' famous illustrations. And you have again, I told you last week how important Uncle Tom's Cabin was and how strongly it motivated the abolitionist cause in the nation, and how heavily Christological it was, grounded in certain understandings of Christ and Christianity. This is one of the famous illustrations from it, where you have a poor slave sort of begging for leniency and help from a very white-looking Jesus. Striking image. Well, you can't understand the 19th century or the 20th or the 18th or the 17th in America without understanding a little bit about slavery. It's fair to say that the Atlantic slave trade actually started at the beginning of the 19th century, or I'm sorry, the beginning of the 16th century. So it started at the beginning of the 16th century, first with Portuguese slave traders and eventually the Spanish, who would take slaves from the West Africa to colonies these nations had formed in first South America. Over the course of the next couple of centuries, this practice would expand fairly dramatically. The practice would particularly expand with the involvement of groups like the French, the Dutch, the Danish, and the English. We estimate that the slave trade at its peak, this is from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, which is considered to be a definitive source, that between 1525 and 1866, in the entire history of the slave trade in the New World or North America, there were 12.5 million African slaves or African people taken to the, quote, New World and sold into slavery. A great percentage of those were taken to places like Brazil and really throughout South America. The West Indies and the Caribbean in general also received a huge amount of that human cargo, those slaves. Based on our best estimates, we guess out of that 12.5 million folks taken from Africa, only about 10.7 million survived. The voyage, as we'll talk a little bit more about, was incredibly treacherous, incredibly dangerous, and the conditions were very unhygienic and ripe for the spread of disease. To the British colonies or North America more generally, we actually assume, based on our research and data, that only about 388,000 of this first generation of slaves made their way to North America. The lion's share ended up in parts of South America, the West Indies or the Caribbean, where life expectancy was actually much shorter than North America. This is a famous illustration of the triangular slave trade. Again, most of the first generation of slaves were taken from West Africa. This is a plan of the British slave ship, the Brooks, from 1789. You can see how, if you look closely, those markings are of human beings being kind of crowded into that ship. A French artist in the 19th century, the late 19th century, tried to illustrate what that might have looked like. It's hard to know with any accuracy if that's the case, but these slave ships were incredibly crowded. Again, ripe for disease. All of us have become experts on epidemiology in recent months. This is a great example of really bad conditions. You can understand why the mortality rate was so high and people would become infected with smallpox and other disease. It was a huge problem. It cost millions of lives. Usually when we talk about the slave trade, we talk about two major periods of it, at least in the United States. So there's the famous Middle Passage, which lasts from 1619 to 1808. 1808 is when the transatlantic slave trade was officially ended in North America, or at least the United States. And this is what we were just talking about. This is the transportation of about 10.7 million Africans to the Americas in that period, again, from 1619 to 1808. What you may not know as much about, and probably some of you know a tremendous amount about it, but all of you may not, is what we refer to as the Second Middle Passage. This is that period from 1787 to 1861. So that's 7 decades after the Constitution. And this is the relocation of over 1 million people from the Upper South to the Lower South in the domestic slave trade. Why did this happen? Well, it had to do with the expansion of cotton industry. Cotton became which was the first luxury good in the Americas, maybe the world, was extremely profitable. And even after the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1794, well, the big plantation owners realized that with the cotton gin, they can now make even more money on cotton and produce more of it, which made slave trade even more profitable. But again, the problem was the transatlantic slave trade had ended in 1808. So it became very common for slaveholders in the Lower South to try to acquire slaves from those in the upper South. We often refer to this as the second Middle Passage. Cotton, again, enormously profitable. And I do want to point out, while it's really beyond the scope of our lesson to get too deep into this, I do want to point out that cotton was not just the major source of industry for the South. The production of cotton-based goods, in some ways, is what made New York City, well, the cosmopolitan, big industrial city it is today. It was also extremely profitable for New England. And so the North itself profited tremendously by the slave trade and by cotton production in the South. Interestingly, so did England. England was really the world, it's a little bit of an anachronistic phrase, but really the world superpower in its day, even in the 19th century. It was a rich, powerful country. And it's fair to say that as much as 40% of Britain's exports were from textiles mills acquired, again, from Southern cotton in the U.S. And this is an image from Harper's Weekly of slaves working cotton. Okay, so that's a little bit of setup. Here is a famous ad from the 19th century of slaves being sold, to be sold on board the ship. The choice of a cargo of about 200 fine, healthy Negroes just arrived from windward in the Rice Coast. The utmost care has already been taken and shall be continued to keep them free from the least danger of becoming infected with smallpox. This is an ad that was posted in Charleston in the early 19th century. Here's an ad that would trace itself to that second period I was talking about a moment ago. Again, slaves were often sold within the United States even after the end of the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. If you're curious about the words bucks and winch, men were often called bucks and women were often called winches. Winch is also a word that was used for prostitute. So you can see it's derogatory language, but it's often used to refer to women who are being sold into slavery. Okay, so American slavery was particularly vile. Yes, slavery had existed in the world for a very long time. People like to use that, even in the 19th century, as a justification for slavery, though I'm not quite sure why that argument was ever compelling to people. But American slavery was particularly vile. While it's true that some slavery had existed in Africa, in fact, that's often where the first generation of slaves came from, people who'd been taken prisoner. It's also true that in most parts of Africa, people could actually become free again. Slavery usually resulted from warfare, or in some rare cases from unpaid debts, but it was also possible in big parts of Africa for slaves to eventually procure their own freedom again. Their children were not usually considered slaves, so forth and so on. In America, slaves were treated as chattel, or pieces of property that had no rights. The vast majority of the first generation of slaves were actually taken from the western part of Africa. Now, I only point that out today because one of the myths that has often been assumed about slavery is that most of those held in bondage in America had never encountered Christianity before. It's actually not true. While it's true that a lot of the slaves had practiced some indigenous religions, religions like Yoruba, it's also true that about 30 to 40% of the first generation of slaves actually had been exposed to particularly Catholicism. The area that we now think of as the Republic of Congo, where a lot of the first generation of slaves would have emerged from, Catholics had actually been there for over a century before the slave trade really began to proliferate. And so most of those slaves who would come from that part of Africa would have at least been exposed to Christianity. Some may have actually been Christian. We guess that between 30 and 50% had actually been exposed to Christianity in these days. It's also fair to say that maybe 5 to 10% had been Islamic or had at least encountered Islam in a meaningful way. So Western forms of religion were not foreign to all of the first generation of slaves. It's fair to say that maybe 50 to 60% actually had a fairly good awareness of Christianity. That quote, "American slavery, the vilest that ever saw the sun," is actually from John Wesley. If there are any Methodists online, John Wesley is the founder of Methodism. He wrote several, towards the end of his life, virulent anti-slavery pieces. He very much opposed the trade. This is an image from the Library of Congress, which shows some of the constraint gear used to, well, inhibit those being transported and held in bondage. You can tell how much they look like torture instruments because indeed they are. Okay. As we discussed last week, the early 19th century large revivals of religion contributed to the growth of Christianity in the South and really throughout the nation more broadly conceived. In the 19th century, in those first decades, we have three major forms of Christianity beginning to really grow, and they're all very close in identity. Again, your Methodist, your Baptist, and your Presbyterians are the three groups that really begin to dominate the South in the 19th century. In the background here, you see a map for a camp meeting. Now, some of you probably have never heard of camp meetings before, where others of you online, particularly if you're Cumberland Presbyterian, and even some of you Methodists may be very familiar with camp meetings. But camp meetings were one of the major tools used to evangelize in the South and really throughout the rest of the country as well in the 19th century. These were big outdoor revivals, and they were incredibly popular in the 19th century. People would often come during harvest seasons after harvest season was over, to be part of them. They became big community affairs, and they contributed to the rapid growth of these pro-revival denominations. Again, Baptists and Methodists enjoyed special success, with the Presbyterians a little bit further behind. Presbyterians often had higher standards and wanted more control over these and the message being presented at camp meetings, which held them back a little bit over the Methodists and Baptists, who had, well, not to be offensive, and I am Methodist, didn't have as high standards. One of the things that happened, though, as a byproduct of these big revivals is that more and more Christian missionaries wanted to be able to reach slaves. They wanted to be able to include in their evangelism efforts not only white people, but also Black people in the South. Early on, that was incredibly controversial. Many slaveholders did not want missionaries coming in to speak to the slaves. Why, you might ask? Well, there's a few reasons for that. One of which is, and I would argue it's the main reason, is that many slaveholders began to fear that if their slaves became Christian, then it would mean that they would have to be treated as full human beings and not just as pieces of property. Also, many slaveholders were deeply scared of groups like the Methodists and even some Presbyterian groups because many had strong abolitionist or anti-slavery stances. But what begins to happen is many of these evangelical groups begin to compromise their morals and actually relent on slavery in order to appeal to white Southern planters. So groups like the Methodist, I told you a moment ago that the Methodist founder John Wesley was fiercely anti-slavery. Well, the Methodists gave up that stance in order to be allowed to evangelize and, quote, save the souls of those held in slavery and bondage. It was hugely immoral, hugely problematic. In fact, it's fair to say that when the slaveholders did begin to allow white missionaries to come and speak to their folks, they didn't permit the missionaries to teach those held in bondage how to read. They were fearful of the ability of folks to read and write. And as you well know, literacy is a remarkable skill and one that can allow people to seek their own liberation with a little bit more ease. This is from a quote from John Fields, who was 89 at the time he gave it. He was part of the Federal Writers Project slave narratives done in the early 20th century. He himself was a slave for many, many years. And most of us colored folks was the great desire to read and write. We took advantage of every opportunity to educate ourselves. The greater part of the plantation owners were very harsh if we were caught trying to learn or write. It was a law that if a white man was caught trying to educate a Negro slave, he was liable to prosecution, entailing a fine of $50 and a jail sentence. We were never allowed to go to town. It was not until after I ran away that I knew that they sold anything but slaves, tobacco, and whiskey. Our ignorance was the greatest hold the South had on us. Between the 1830s and 50s, Many Christian denominations began to give up anti-slavery stances in order to evangelize those held in bondage. Because of that, Black membership in both Southern Baptist and Methodist churches in particular really began to grow. In fact, it's fair to say that the Baptist church by the 1850s had grown from about 200 to 400,000 Black members. The Methodists were in a similar vein, going from about 118,000 to about 210,000 between 1846 and 61. And what missionaries really tried to do with their message and how they were allowed such unfettered access to the slaves is the missionaries began to tell folks, well, in fact, Christianity will not liberate your slaves. They didn't use that phrase, but they did use this one. Christianity will teach slaves how to be better slaves, more obedient to their masters. And that was a big selling point to many slaveholders who desperately liked that idea. African Christianity, or African American Christianity, as it emerged in the early 19th century, was a little different than its white counterpart. This is a list from famous theorist and essayist W.E.B. Du Bois. It was adapted a little bit by Albert Rabbiteau, who's a great historian. Du Bois argues that there are three major characteristics of Black Christianity that began to emerge. Black Christianity was ecstatic. It focused on Bible-centered preaching. And in fact, most of the first generation of African-American preachers focused much more on big images than their white counterparts, the big narrative thrusts of the Bible. And that may have come because the first generation of slave preachers were not allowed to learn how to read or write. So they had to memorize the stories of the Bible, which they did, some of them in spectacular ways. But there was much more focused on exciting, big narratives from the Bible. African American worship also was and remains characterized by very lively music. Shouting and religious excitement was also a common characteristic of Black Christianity. There was a lot of that in white Christianity in the early 19th century too, though that began to level off as white Christians became more middle class in the middle of the 19th century. Then Albert Rabbiteau adds a fourth to W.E.B. Du Bois' list. He says that Black Christianity was also noted for a strong emphasis on conversion. And this is what begins to develop both in the independent Black churches in the North, but also on the plantations. This is Reverend Green, who was a former slave preacher. At night, it was a common thing for us to sit outside. Sometimes somebody would start humming an old hymn, and then the next door neighbor would pick it up. And this way, it would finally get around to every house. And then the music started. Soon everybody would be gathered together, and such singing. It wouldn't be long before some of the slaves got happy and started shouting. There were two major forms of religion that began to develop on the plantation. The first were religious services held under the supervision of white slaveholders. Basically, slaves were often allowed time off to attend worship services on Sunday. They were also allowed time off to attend religious services on holidays, and then camp meetings as well. And camp meetings were almost always segregated, where the Black people would be forced to sit in the very back. They would often have a Black preacher preaching to them. But Sundays became a really important time. Again, many slaveholders used religion as a way to rationalize the slave trade, or even more overtly to convince themselves that religion could be used to make slaves better slaves, more obedient. It became not incredibly uncommon for some slaveholders. Again, most of the slaves were concentrated in the hands of a minority of planters in the South. So many of the large planters would actually build praise houses, if you will, small churches, if you will, on their plantations for the slaves worshiping there. It was not uncommon for the white masters, their families, or even their representatives to actually be present in those services, largely to monitor what was being said there. This is John Anderson reflecting on camp meetings. Camp meetings were religious holidays, and many slaveholders actually used them as a chance to give the slaves a little taste of freedom. They would make an effort to actually get them drunk on alcohol and lots of other things as well, which Frederick Douglass thought was meant to scare them away from freedom. So planters in these sanctioned services, if you will, held on the plantations, often tried to control the message of the plantation preachers. They would make sure that the preacher did not speak about liberation or freedom, and instead focused on texts that talked about obedience of slaves to their masters. The white master was also scared of religious enthusiasm and shouting, and was very careful to make sure that was curtailed in his presence and in his family's presence. Again, special focus was given to the parts of the Bible that describe the duties of servants to masters. And this was a big part of the message that was preached. This is a picture of a praise house. It still stands. It's in St. Helena's Island in South Carolina. It's one of the last existing praise houses. One of the spaces that that a planter in South Carolina had built for slaves to worship. As you can see, it is not a luxurious church. As of the 90s, it actually still had a practicing congregation in it. I don't know if it still does, but you can tell it's not very large and it's not very well ventilated. This is the exact opposite of a space you want to hold services in during an epidemic, right? Or pandemic, rather. So, yeah, this is from St. Helena's Island in South Carolina. But spaces like this were built. Black preachers were usually recruited to lead the worship. This is Lucretia Alexander. Again, this is part of, she's a former slave reflecting in the 20th century. She said the preacher came and he'd just say, serve your masters. Don't steal your master's turkey. Don't steal your master's chickens. Don't steal your master's hogs. Don't steal your master's meat. Do whatsoever your master tells you to do. Same old thing all the time. So the worship in these settings became characterized by messages that talked about servitude and obedience. Here's a piece from the London News depicting what a worship in a slave community might have looked like. You can see, if you look closely, that the white slaveholder and his family are not too far from the pulpit, looking on paternalistically in a controlling fashion. You don't see shouting and excitement here that you might have seen in different settings. This is another former slave, Frank Robertson. You slaves will go to heaven if you are good, but don't ever think you'll be close to your mistress and master. No, no. There will be a wall between you, but there will be holes in it that will permit you to look on and see your mistress when she passes by. If you want to sit behind this wall, you must do the language of the text, obey your master. Again, you see over and over again this emphasis on obedience. This is what slaves were hearing during those services. And the role of the slave preacher is a very interesting one, and we don't have enough time to really get into the nuances of it, but they were former slaves, or they were slaves rather, who were usually recruited because of their oratory skill, and many of them were very gifted preachers, by the white slaveholder. It was a privileged status in your community, but you were closely supervised by the white slaveholders. And again, most of the slave preachers were illiterate. A few learned how to read and write on their own, but they kept that on the down low. The vast majority were illiterate, and they relied on white people to read during the services, and they relied on their own memories to memorize vast swaths of the Bible. And many of them were incredibly gifted in their ability to actually basically memorize the New Testament. But yeah. So another quote from Harriet Gresham, another former slave. A Negro preacher delivered sermons on the plantation, services being held in the church used by whites after the services on Sunday. The preacher must always act as a peacemaker and mouthpiece for the master. So they were told to be subservient to their masters in order to enter the kingdom of God. But the slaves held secret meetings and had praying grounds where they met a few at a time to pray for better things. So a couple things you may notice from this quote. First, the preacher, again, as I've said over and over again, was forced to act as a mouthpiece for the master, at least in the master's earshot. So they tended to be subservient to the masters. You also may have gathered from the first line there that sometimes, in addition to praise houses, services were actually held in the white church, but after the whites had met. But the third thing, and this is what we're going to focus on now, is that many slaves began to hold secret prayer meetings. So many of those held in bondage began to worship in secret away from their master's ear and awareness in the hush harbors, deep in the woods, the praying grounds, sometimes these are called. These were folks that were so starving for real Christianity, a Christianity that liberated, not just oppressed, that they began to worship in secret. This is Peter Randolph reflecting on that in Virginia. The slaves assemble in the swamp, the first one arriving breaking boughs from the tree in the direction of the selected spot. Arrangements are then made for conducting the exercises. The first ask each other how they feel, the state of their minds. The male members then select a certain space in separate groups for the division of the meeting. Preaching by the brethren, then praying and singing all around until they generally feel quite happy. The speaker usually commences by calling myself unworthy and talks very slowly until feeling the Spirit, he grows excited. In a short time, they fall to the ground, 20 or 30 men and women under its influence. What Peter Randolph is talking about there is not only their method for selecting secret spaces and how they point others to them by breaking boughs from the tree, but also the kind of religious ecstasy that would come over people in these worship settings. Doesn't exactly remind me of my Sunday morning worship experience at a Methodist congregation. This sounds a lot more exciting, doesn't it, to you as well? But that's what was happening in these settings. Now, the problem is that slaves would be punished if they were caught going to these secret meetings. In fact, there are cases of, for example, a deacon of a local Baptist church, a man by the name of Henry Bibb, was threatened by his slaveholder with 500 lashes if he was caught. For others, it could even result in death or imprisonment. So what those held in bondage had to do was learn interesting techniques to mask the sound. They would usually choose a secluded place in the woods. Sometimes they would meet in the home of a sympathizer or a freed black person in the area that existed, which it usually didn't. Sometimes they used wetted quilts and rags and laid those around the area they were meeting in to try to absorb the sound. Sometimes they spoke over a kettle of water. If they were inside of a house of some sort, they often had an iron pot or kettle turned upside down to catch the sound in that space. They came up with ingenious ways to try to hide themselves so they could have genuine worship of the Lord there. This could be very loud, so they had to develop techniques for shielding the sound. This is a former slave, Lucretia Alexander. I don't know where they learned to do that. I kind of think the Lord put these things in their minds to do for themselves, just like he helps us Christians in other ways. Don't you think? So this form of religion had a lot of positive effects on those held in bondage. It's fair to say that these services provided a venue for where hope for the present and the future was fostered. This may have been the birth, what we think of as Black liberation theology, at least in a proto way. It was also here where ceremony could actually take place. While you couldn't have an official wedding ceremony, not that would be recognized by the state in these secret worship services, you could have rituals and ceremonies that would mark that in people's lives, even as the state would never recognize it. And this became incredibly important because particularly during that second phase of the slave trade in America, that second migration period, families were widely and often broken up when slaves were sold. And I would argue also that the theology that was fostered in these secret meetings became a protest of sorts against that dehumanizing theology of those white slaveholders. So we have these secret worship services. We also have slaves, those held in bondage, beginning to develop their own way of singing. We call these spirituals today. Spirituals likely can trace at least some of their roots to songs sung in Africa. But in the slave communities, a certain form of singing began to develop. You've heard spirituals today. You know what I'm talking about to some extent. The first major account of spirituals was actually published by a guy by the name of Thomas Higginson, who commanded the first Union regiment of freed slaves, the South Carolina Volunteers. And he actually wrote a lot about the spirituals he heard his men sing. And these were songs often sung both inside and outside of worship settings. They would be sung during work. And they were often songs that were shouted as well as sung. And in some occasions, we don't know how common this was. We have spirituals actually being used, well, as messages. You've got the signal songs where sometimes like a planned escape was communicated with the spiritual. Then in some cases, we do not know how widespread these were in terms of use. Songs and spirituals were actually used to lead people to specific points on the Underground Railroad. We call these map songs. One of the most famous for this is Follow the Drinking Gourd. When the sun come back, when the first quail calls, then the time has come, follow the drinking gourd. Follow the drinking gourd, follow the drinking gourd. For the old man say, follow the drinking gourd. This is an interesting case study because it's one of the ones we know the most about, but when the sun came back might refer to the beginning of spring. When the first quail calls would refer to the beginning of quail breeding season, which is in the spring. Drinking gourd would refer to the Big Dipper, pointing north, of course. And then even old man would refer to a conductor on the Underground Railroad known as Peg Leg Joe, who was a former sailor, old man being nautical slang. So according to legend, Joe would actually go into slave communities posing as a handyman, and he would actually teach this song to people. And this song would eventually lead to, well, freedom. The second verse here is how that occurs. The river's bank, very good road. The dead trees show the way, left foot, peg foot, going on, follow the drinking gourd. So this seems to actually point to a route from Mobile, Alabama, that would eventually lead to freedom. And the Underground Railroad is incredibly important in this era. It's perhaps as much of a Southern boogeyman as it is a real force, but it becomes incredibly important in the lives of all of those enslaved and in the minds of the abolitionists as well. The Underground Railroad likely has its origins to the 18th century. It was fueled by Christian abolitionists, particularly Quakers, but also free black people in the South, the independent black churches. And it was essentially a series of houses, of safe spots to the north that an escaped slave could take. It assisted many of those who were seeking routes to freedom. These homes, churches, and businesses were sometimes called stations, and their owners were known as station masters. We estimate that between 1830 and 1860, that roughly 3,000 slaves would escape captivity and make their way either to Canada or to some northern state. Canada became more popular as a destination after the Fugitive Slave Act I told you about at the beginning of our lesson was passed in 1850. This is an image of the runaway. You often see it accompanied with masters who post ads in local papers and periodicals trying to reclaim their captured slave. Now, the most famous conductor of the Underground Railroad was a woman by the name of Harriet Tubman. This is a name you've likely heard in your life. She is a sensational, fascinating figure. She was actually born into slavery in 1822 in Maryland, and she would eventually escape on her own. Upon reaching freedom, she would proclaim, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person now that I was free. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. Harriet was motivated by both a fearlessness and a love of her family. And at first, to rescue her own family members, she actually would make at least 13 trips back to Maryland. We estimate that she rescued at least 70 slaves. That number may be higher, but most of the records we have point to about 70. And she became incredibly famous for her fearlessness and her bravery. And Tubman was somebody who was deeply religious. In fact, she had suffered a head injury when she was fairly young, actually trying to help someone trying to escape slavery. And that head injury would plague her for the rest of her life. But it was also after that head injury that she began to have these powerful visionary experiences where she would receive visions from God. And she believed that the Holy Spirit walked with her very closely, keeping her safe and empowering her. And she was a fearless woman, really fearless. And she was very clever in her methodology. She would send messages to slaves and have them meet about 8 to 10 miles away from their plantations. Slaves would often leave plantations on Saturday nights because they would often have the Sabbath off to worship. So if they went missing, they wouldn't be noticed until Monday. She would also hire people to go into these southern communities and remove posters that were being posted around town wanting to reclaim this freed or this now newly escaped slave. There are even examples, she carried a pistol with her, of her on more than one occasion having to turn a pistol on a slave that was having second thoughts because she couldn't undermine the entire operation. She's a fascinating figure, absolutely remarkable, her level of fearlessness. During the Civil War, she would actually act as a nurse and a scout. She would actually recruit a group of former slaves to hunt for rebel camps and report on the movement of Confederate troops. And then famously in 1863, she went with Colonel James Montgomery and about 150 black soldiers and did a gunboat raid in South Carolina. She helped lead a gunboat raid. The woman was a force of nature, one of the greatest Americans to ever live, and her own fearlessness is something we could all learn a little bit from. This is a recently discovered photo. It's now in the Library of Congress. We didn't discover it until 2017. This is young Harriet Tubman. She's only about 45 years of age here, so it's a little bit different than some of the other pictures you may have seen. This was taken in 1868, so it's actually what she would have looked like during the era where she was leading some of these adventures, if you will. This is a famous quote from her. I'd reasoned this out in my mind. There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. I would have the other, for no man should take me alive. I should fight for my liberty as long as my strength lasted. And when the time came for me to go, the Lord would let them take me. This is Harriet towards the end of her life. She dies actually relatively impoverished. The story I told you at the beginning of today was actually part of a collection of stories by an abolitionist writer with Harriet's cooperation that was trying to raise money for Harriet Tubman. This is her toward the end of her life in 1911. She was ill. She'd actually undergone brain surgery, which I don't need to tell you is incredibly scary today, but in the early 20th century, a little bit more scary. God's time, emancipation is always near. He set the North Star in the heavens. He gave me the strength in my limbs. He meant I should be free. I was the conductor of the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. One of the spirituals that would be sung, swing low, sweet chariot. Well, the word Harriet was often substituted on slave communities, and even outside of that. Swing low, sweet Harriet, coming forward to bring me home, or to carry me home. Her home is still preserved in upstate New York. I told you she was a lifelong member of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, the Freedom Church. Frederick Douglass was also a member of that church. Her home is still preserved by that denomination, as is the home for the elderly that she established toward the end of her life and ended up living in her last days when she was very invalid. This is her church near the same property. Okay, so we're about out of time, but there are two major forms of religion that do begin to develop on the slave communities. And it's fair to say that by the 1850s, abolitionism really has grown in the North in a big way. It contributed to those schisms we talked about last week, those church schisms. But it's also fair to say that as the brutality of slavery became more and more well known, abolitionists began to become more, their conscience became more and more pricked, and they became more and more inflamed by what was going on. Stories and examples of freed slaves and their work in trying to free other slaves, like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, contributed to that in a big way. For today, there's a lot we can learn from this. I think that it's fair to say that Christianity is something that we need to pay attention to, because at times, while Christianity is something we always assume is a good thing, we also need to recognize that in our own lives, each of us has probably seen times when the Christian faith has been used as a tool for social control. Sometimes people think they have an absolute hold on how you should interpret Scripture, and they will use Christianity and its social organizations as a way to control and oppress other people. And I also would say that sometimes when we see manifestations of Christianity that make us uncomfortable, we need to understand that everybody brings different sets of cultural assumptions and experiences into the way they interpret faith. The Black Christians did that in the 19th century, and in fact, they forged the more liberative version of Christianity, the time when many white folks were seeing Christianity as something that could be used to further their own ends and oppressive purposes. I want to close with a passage from Frederick Douglass that has always been haunting to me. It was in the first version of his autobiography, which I would heavily encourage you to read if you've never read it before. It's fairly short, at least the first volume is. He has this appendix at the end where he's trying to rationalize how he's dealt with religion throughout the text. It says, "What I have said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slaveholding religion of this land, and with no possible reference to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of the one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason, but the most deceitful one, for calling the religion of this land Christianity. We have men stealers for ministers, women whippers for missionaries, and cradle plunderers for church members. The man who wields the blood-clotted cowskin during the week fills the pulpit on Sunday and claims to be a minister of the meek and lowly Jesus. The man who robs me of my earnings at the end of each week meets me as a class leader on Sunday morning to show me the way of life and the path of salvation. He who sells my sister for purposes of prostitution stands forth as the pious advocate of purity. He who proclaims it a religious duty to read the Bible denies me the right of learning to read the name of God who made me. He who is the religious advocate of marriage robs whole millions of its sacred influences and leads them to the ravages of the whole-scale pollution. The warm defender of the sacredness of the family relation is the same that scatters whole families. The slave auctioneer's bell and the church-going bell chime in with each other, and the bitter cry of the heartbroken slave are drowned in the religious shouts of his pious master. Revivals of religion and the revivals in the slave trade go hand in hand together. The slave prison and the church stand near each other. The clanking of fetters and the rattling of chains in the prison and the pious psalm and psalm prayer in the church may be heard at the same time." Douglas was pointing out what we've tried to show today is that Christianity can and has at times be used for ill as well as good. All right, I went a little bit longer than I intended, but we have a few minutes left. What kind of questions do we have today?
Michael, we had one question earlier about slave patrols and how those were organized and what linkage they may or may not have with policing in contemporary America.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated and good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer for it. I think it's fair to say that slave patrols to try to recapture slaves, and certainly the work that was done with the Fugitive Slave Act, are examples of military and law enforcement being used to suppress and dehumanize African-American people. You definitely can see some parallels with some of what we are seeing in the press today around, the oppression of the policing of African-American communities. I definitely see those parallels. It's a really interesting idea.
Good, thank you. Other questions from people there's one coming in. Will you share the reading list on the website?
Oh, well, this is a brief one I put together. So basically it would fit on a slide. There are obviously 100 more books I could recommend. I'm going to put some of these PowerPoints up on the website when I have a little bit more time. Hopefully this week I'll get to the first two. And I'll try to put a reading list up as well that it's just going to be very selective. There's always a mixture of folks who are on these. Some of you are deep aficionados and deeply knowledgeable about these subjects and probably want some very advanced readings. And some of you are probably just looking to get a little bit deeper of an overview. So I'll try to include a little bit of both and let you know what category those fit into. Here are some pretty good books, though, that have been published in the last decade or so, or a couple decades. So if you want to learn more about slave religion or how religion operated in the slave communities, I really recommend Albert Rabbito's book, Slave Religion, The Invisible Institution of the Antebellum South. It is a classic for a reason. It's a groundbreaking book. If you want a shorter version of that, he's got a good chapter on the topic in his Canaan Land, A Religious History of African Americans, which is a very short textbook. I use it in class sometimes. It's pretty cheap. It's actually designed to, I think it runs about $10.
Right. Thank you. seeing any other questions at this point, and we are about at our time. So thank you, Dr. Turner, and thanks everybody who participated this morning. As always, these are being recorded, and the recorded version will be up on the Memphis Theological Seminary website. Typically gets up there on Tuesday or Wednesday, if you want to share with your friends. And again, Michael, thank you. And next week is Abraham Lincoln.
Always a favorite of mine to talk about.
Looking forward to that. So we'll see everybody next Sunday.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.